For falsifying business records, those charges carry up to 4 years behind bars, and the judge has previously said that doesn't necessarily mean that this defendant will face any time behind bars. Now, the judge has said he had threatened the former president before with jail time for violating the gag order because he just kind of blew past any kind of financial reprimand and said, you know, if you violate this again, I'm going to put you behind bars. That didn't happen, but it all remains to be seen. And then will those charges be stacked if we have a sentencing? Clearly, this is going to go to appeal.
Sure.
There's no question about that.
And quickly. I think Trump is expected to appeal this very quickly, and then from there, the sentence, whether it's jail or probation, that'll be up to the judge. That is something, I was listening to lawyers talk about this today, that is something he could postpone for many months. We might not actually see a sentence in this until well after the election. So Trump's expected to appeal right away, and then from there, the timeline is kind of unclear. But we mentioned before, they're polling the jury now one by one, and according to Associated Press reporters who are in that courtroom right now, he's, quote, sitting stone-faced in court, looking down as the jury found him guilty, and then staring at each member of the jury as they reiterate their guilty verdict one by one in the courtroom.
And it's interesting to see what will happen as this plays out. So one mandate by the judge in this case was that the former president must attend every day of trial. And he has said before, this is really hurting me. He's running for a return to the White House to try and challenge President Biden right now. And so this is kind of crunch time leading up to the November general election. And this will be interesting to see because clearly, I mean, everybody has had hawk eyes on what's going to happen with this verdict. Now we know guilty on all 34 counts. It doesn't come as a surprise to many who said that this was kind of a foregone conclusion. Others are shocked by it. But he kind of laid the groundwork to say he expected to be convicted in this based on what was being laid out as a threshold. And one of the jury instructions the judge gave to the 12 members of this jury before they were started deliberation was he said, if you find that a crime was committed, you must then find that the former president was involved in it. So that was one of the thresholds that it was moving forward.
Whether that other crime was election interference or tax fraud or something else, I mean, they didn't really specify what that other crime might be. That was kind of one of the odd parts of this trial.
Didn't they stipulate that the other crime was conspiracy to unlawfully influence the 2016 election? Now, there has been a lot of banter and pontificating on like the legality of that because it seems one of those arguments over time and decades that you have candidates running for any given office of public office, elected officials, who will enter into non-disclosure agreements with people to try and, in essence, do the same activity, suppress any negative news that could hinder their opportunities to, you know, win that election. So this is not a new tactic, but now they're saying the prosecutors have contended that that was the initial crime that this is connected to, because falsifying business records alone is not the crime in of itself as a felony.
Right. Well, they said they prosecute about 1,000 of those falsified business records cases every year, but most of them don't go to trial. Most of the time the person involved pleads. I think only about 10% of these cases actually go to trial. There's no way that Donald Trump was ever going to plead guilty to a case like this.
Not at all. And obviously, you know, there were a lot of salacious details that came out when former porn star Stormy Daniels took the stand, and even the judge said, you know, way too much information here. And I think that was very interesting in the closing arguments. It was like a tale of two cities. It was like, you need to focus on they're just trying to distract you with a salacious story, and that's not what this is about. But then prosecutors said, no, it wasn't just Michael Cohen, who, yes, he has been found to lie under oath before, because I think that was the defense's argument in closing. They really honed in on Michael Cohen, saying if they're pinning this case and the evidence of this case on Michael Cohen, he is a convicted liar. And so how can you trust him and an alleged co-conspirator here? So we're watching as folks are starting to file out of court right now.
I mean, when you talk about Michael Cohen, he's an admitted liar. He went to jail for
Right.
lying, and he was, I guess you could say, the star witness in this, but all of the information he provided was corroborated. There are some of the former president's attorneys walking out. All of the information Michael Cohen provided was corroborated by supporters of Donald Trump, including David Pecker, who still likes him, still supports him, by Hope Hicks,
yeah,
who worked with him so closely for years and broke down emotionally on the stand during her testimony, again corroborating a lot of what Michael Cohen would go on to later tell the jury a couple weeks later.
You know, and it's interesting because the president has said before, well, hey, I signed off on these checks, yes, and they were labeled as legal fees, but who else wouldn't argue that, you know, a payout to your attorney, whether the line item is reimbursement for a payout to a porn star or your legal advice, it's irrelevant. He said he didn't make any difference between that, and there was no intent to falsify any business records.
I think the man with his back to us might be Eric Trump, and behind that person, whether it's Eric or not, is Donald Trump. You could just kind of see him kind of in the reflection there. So it looks like they are leaving court, and this is that hallway where we've had the one live camera set up for the past couple of weeks. And we've seen the former president come out and make any number of speeches about the day's proceedings, about the trial, about the judge, and it does appear he's coming out now.
Mr. Trump, what do you have to say to the American people? Mr. Trump, how is it going to be convicted of felony? Are you worried about going to jail?
This was a disgrace. This was a rigged trial by a conflicted judge who was corrupt. It's a rigged trial, a disgrace. They wouldn't give us a venue change. We were at 5% or 6% in this district, in this area. This was a rigged, disgraceful trial. The real verdict is going to be November 5th by the people. And they know what happened here, and everybody knows what happened here. You have a Soros-backed DA, and the whole thing, we didn't do a thing wrong. I'm a very innocent man, and it's okay. I'm fighting for our country. I'm fighting for our Constitution. Our whole country is being rigged right now. This was done by the Biden administration in order to wound or hurt an opponent, a political opponent. And I think it's just a disgrace. And we'll keep fighting. We'll fight till the end and we'll win. Because our country's gone to hell. We don't have the same country anymore. We have a divided mess. We're a nation in decline, serious decline. Millions and millions of people pouring into our country right now from prisons and from mental institutions, terrorists. And they're taking over our country. We have a country that's in big trouble. But this was a rigged decision right from day one with a conflicted judge who should have never been allowed to try this case, never. And we will fight for our Constitution. This is long from over. Thank you very much.
Why should voters vote for a convicted felon?
All right, we've heard former President Trump make pretty much those same statements every day for the last couple of weeks during this trial. The difference is today history's been made. For the first time, former president of the United States has been convicted of criminal charges, 34 criminal charges, 34 guilty verdicts from that jury in New York City today. Just to be clear, because this is something Trump says a lot. This is in New York City. This was the Manhattan DA. This has nothing to do with Washington, D.C., the Biden administration, or the Department of Justice whatsoever. He also said millions of people are pouring into the country from prisons. Of course, that is not true at all. We normally, sometimes, these days don't take his speeches live because it's full of a lot of misinformation, and that was the same today. But we felt like it was appropriate to take him live and full there just now because of the historic nature of what has happened in this courtroom this afternoon.
Yeah, it is historic, Jared. He said the real verdict will be November 5th by the people at the ballot box. The sentencing is slated for July 11th. And we have live in studio with us criminal defense attorney Jason Lamb. Thank you for joining us because this is a moment in history. So we know that former President Trump had been indicted on 3 other criminal indictments. This is the first conviction that we're seeing, and it remains to be seen how that could impact his campaign moving forward. But this is big news.
This is a solemn day. This is the first time that a president or former president of the United States of America has been criminally charged with felony offenses and now convicted. You're right, Nicole. This really has nothing to do with the other three cases right now, the federal cases. And I'm sorry, I misspoke. The two federal cases and the one Georgia state case. But this is serious. And you can advance all the false narratives you want about the administration, immigration, how yesterday we heard from Mr. Trump that a unanimous verdict was not required. That's nonsense. That is just simply a distractor from the fact that Donald Trump, per the American justice system, in accordance with a verdict from a jury of his peers, whether he likes them or not, has now been convicted of felonies. And that is a very solemn moment in this country's history.
They took 10 hours to come up with this verdict, and I was talking to somebody I know in the district attorney's office in New York City, and they were split over what they thought that was going to mean. Some thought it would mean not guilty, some thought it would mean guilty, but it seems 10 hours isn't a whole lot of time. They asked for some clarification about some of the testimony and then very quickly delivered this verdict.
Well, there's 30 some odd counts. New York is actually a little bit different than in other jurisdictions like Arizona. And I also spoke to a former New York DA this morning. I'm hopeful it wasn't the same person. Here, jurors get to take the instructions back to the jury room.
Yeah.
And it's sort of a roadmap of what to do because they are really following the law and they're applying the facts to the law. They don't get that in New York. And that's why they wanted to read back of some of the instructions. And you can read tea leaves any way you want from jury questions. But I think, and this is just me, I think when they were asking about David Pecker's testimony,
The publisher of the National Enquirer.
Correct, who really was at the heart of this catch and kill plan. That said a lot because in my mind, and I'm only one lawyer in Arizona, the jury wanted to say, hey, Michael Cohen, he is what he is. He's got his issues, he's got his credibility issues. But are there other things that would corroborate his testimony? Other witnesses, other documents, like there was an invoice where Alan Weisselberg, who obviously didn't testify because he's in jail.
He's in Rikers Island, isn't he?
He is, for perjury, for loyalty to the Trump organization.
The CFO, former CFO, or some high-ranking official.
He
in the Trump group.
reported directly to Trump. And Michael Cohen, Alan Weisselberg, other people that the prosecution called, these are all people picked by the Trump organization. It wasn't as though they were just simply drafted to work for him. But in any case, you know, to the point of the length of deliberations, I don't think it's a lot of time. Once we knew what the jury was focusing on, corroborating that Trump Tower meeting in 2015, saying, hey, is there something that will validate what Michael Cohen is saying outside of his words? Well, that's where Alan Pecker came in. That's where that invoice where Alan Weisselberg grossed things up. In other words, he raised the numbers to cover taxes and other things that Michael Cohen would be paying. That was the corroboration that made Michael Cohen more credible, and I think it was a fair read from the jury questions yesterday, and frankly, my straw bet that I had on the side with some people, including some in this building, is that we would be here right about this time at the end of the day, roughly 4:30 New York time, a verdict would come in. And here we are.
Yep.
Here we are. One of the other notes from the jury specifically mentioned the judge describing inferring it's raining when people are wearing rain gear and using umbrellas. What did you make of that?
Well, there are two types of evidence, and it doesn't matter if we're in Arizona, New York, Florida. There's direct evidence. You see someone commit a crime, okay? And then there's circumstantial evidence, a fact that you can infer from other evidence.
Right.
And Nicole, if you go outside and you see a lot of people with an umbrella, what is the likely conclusion that you come to?
There you go.
That it's raining.
Yeah.
Jason, a legal question for you. We, over the past year or so, have seen Donald Trump found liable in civil court for a number of different things, from sexual assault to defamation to business fraud. He owes millions of dollars as a result of those judgments. Why is this different? I know it's civil court, and this is criminal court, but why is this more important?
Well, I think the first thing is Donald Trump now faces the possibility of going to prison. I suspect we'll be talking about that at some point. The burden of proof is also different. In a civil case, when money is at issue, we're talking about a preponderance of evidence, 51%, more likely than not. Beyond a reasonable doubt is a lot higher. It is a much more weighty decision. And at the end of the day, it's one thing to say you defamed me, you had corrupt business practices, and you're civilly liable. But again, this is a jury of Donald Trump's peers saying beyond a reasonable doubt, you have committed not one, not two, but over 30 separate felony offenses. It's a big deal.
Felony convictions, which each carry up to 4 years behind bars. Now, the judge has previously said that that doesn't necessarily mean any time behind bars for this defendant. What do you anticipate will happen? I mean, we know that he'll automatically appeal. He's basically said that,
Sure.
That this is a disgrace, a rigged trial, his words, by a conflicted judge who is corrupt. What do you expect? For the timeline of events of appeal and what that would mean before this July 11th sentencing on the calendar.
I'm surprised it's that soon.
It is soon.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, please. I'm going to let people at home in on a little secret that we deal with all the time. We say he faces up to 4 years. That's great for television. It's great for drama. It's not necessarily realistic. Okay. So we'll keep that between us. He is probation eligible. The judge could give him probation anywhere up to the maximum. And a lot of people say, you've got no prior felony history, these are non-violent offenses. Yeah, he's a good candidate for probation. But the judge can also say there is such a protracted pattern. You could impose some jail time in Rikers Island, be cellmates with Alan Weisselberg, and he could go to prison. Now here's the wild card. Donald Trump has been running his mouth left and right. And the judge has such broad discretion. He doesn't have to explain his rationale for a sentencing. He can just do it. And I wouldn't let my client bait a judge and push a gag order and be found in contempt. But it's, representing Donald Trump is like...
Impossible.
Well, it's like holding back a rhinoceros with dental floss.
Yeah, it's absolutely impossible. So you're saying Trump, during this whole process, didn't do anything to put himself in good graces in the minds of the judge, from going after the judge and courtroom employees and witnesses and members of the jury on his Truth Social platform, but also grumbling at some of the witnesses as they came in during testimony. The judge stopped court proceedings at one point to admonish him, or to tell the attorney to go admonish his client.
And you're absolutely right. He didn't endear himself.
He could have at one point. He could have made a change.
He could have, but what I tell my clients, whether they testify or not, you're actually testifying the minute you walk into the courtroom and the minute the jury is looking at you. You can testify in a nonverbal way, with your body language, with your emotions. And if Donald Trump was rolling his eyes, and again, as historic of a case as this was, we had no cameras in the courtroom.
Right.
A lot of times we see video of verdicts being read and audible and visual reactions. We didn't have that. But jurors take careful notes of demeanor. And whether he realized it or not, or whether his lawyers told him or not, he was absolutely testifying, albeit from counsel table, not on the witness stand. And he didn't help himself.
Probably testifying against the recommendations of his counsel, speaking out of turn quite a bit. But like you said, trying to hold back a client like that had to be pretty difficult.
It would be a Herculean endeavor to control a client with that type of ego who's just used to running the show. Now, ultimately, he did listen to his attorneys and he did not testify. That was the right decision.
I bet he wanted to testify.
Oh, I have no doubt that
He said he
wanted
wanted to testify
He said he
in the
regretted,
early days,
and he
right?
said he regretted not testifying in the sex assault, the defamation case, and the sex assault case too. He said he regretted not taking the stand in his own defense there.
And I would venture to guess that in the coming weeks, we're going to hear that Todd Blanche wouldn't let him testify, just like he misrepresented the judge's gag order earlier on to say that the judge isn't allowing me to testify. And Judge Mershon came out very clear on the record in open court and said, you know, Mr. Trump, you've made these statements. I want to be clear. You have an absolute right to testify and a Fifth Amendment right not to testify. That is up to you. My gag order has nothing to do with that. So the judge had to cure that misinformation or disinformation. But at the end of the day, Donald Trump elected not to testify. It was the right move. I say that, you know, as a former prosecutor and as a defense attorney. Very little would have been gained from his testimony. It would have been self-serving. He likely would have blown up on the stand. He is a prosecutor's dream to cross-examine. It was the right move for him not to testify.
If you're just joining us, we want to get you up to speed really quickly. You're looking at a live shot outside the courthouse in Manhattan, where this is a historic afternoon. Former President Donald Trump found guilty on all 34 felony counts of falsifying records to cover up a conspiracy to unlawfully influence the 2016 presidential election. This had to do with that $130,000 payout to a former porn star, Stormy Daniels. That's what those 34 counts were. 34 separate payments, reimbursements to his former attorney, Michael Cohen, his former fixer, who said there was a whole scheme with the National Enquirer to catch and kill any stories that could have harmed the former president's run for the White House just before the 2016 election. It was a very close race that he won over Hillary Clinton at the time. And so a lot has been on the line here. And I'll say when he came out of court after the guilty verdict was read this afternoon and he spoke, repeating those words, disgrace, rigged trial, Jason Lamb, former prosecutor and criminal defense attorney here in the Valleys in studio. So he's really laying the groundwork. He talked about how he tried to get the venue changed. Is that going to be the main crux of an appeal here, in your opinion?
Well, Nicole, I think in the coming weeks, first we're going to see motions for a new trial.
Okay.
They will fail. Judge Mershon is not going to concede that he committed some error unless there is some new dramatic evidence that was not known during the trial. It happens. It's not going to happen in this case. After a sentencing is when an appeal is filed. And I suspect that Donald Trump's lawyers will throw absolutely everything at the wall. Largely, a lot of the decisions that Judge Mershon made were discretionary. And appellate courts use what's called an abuse of discretion standard. And just to break it down, if an appellate court can find any rationale that's legitimate to support the decision that the trial judge made, they're going to uphold or affirm that decision. The real question is, if incarceration is ordered, is it stayed during the pendency of the appeal? Because if that sentencing goes forward on July 11th, and I don't think it will, but I do think it will happen before November 5th, will Donald Trump be incarcerated prior to the appeal taking its course?
I just can't imagine Trump going to spend any time behind bars.
Well, neither can he.
Setting aside the logistics of the Secret Service and how this would even happen, I just can't imagine this judge, for these charges, sending him to prison or to jail.
And I agree with you, Jared. On its face, in a perfect world, okay, it's white collar, it's falsification of business records, it's actually a misdemeanor. However, if it is to further another criminal offense, and we spoke a couple minutes ago about the readback of Alan Pecker's testimony, my sense is that was to examine whether or not it was to further election fraud. I think we all know the records were falsified. That was not a hard conclusion for the jury to come to. But to elevate these charges to a felony That's a big deal. And it was such an elaborate scheme. I agree with you, under normal circumstances, yeah, the guy's not going to see any type of incarceration. But when you combine the depth of the scheme, the breadth of the scheme, and of course his behavior, Mershon may want to send a message. Now, Nicole, you said 4 years, 34 counts.
Right.
I hate doing math on live TV, but 136 years.
Allegedly, supposedly.
Yeah. Okay. I went to law school. I'm not
Right,
a
I know.
mathematician. But it's not going to be a ridiculous sentence, but could it be a sentence that suggests the significance and seriousness of the offense and a deterrent to other individuals? Yes.
Any time behind bars would be supremely symbolic.
And indeed, and
Yeah.
we can anticipate that if there is a sentence of incarceration, the rhetoric will be that it's election interference,
Right.
it'll keep him from campaigning and whatnot. You know, these rants that Donald Trump has gone on, just as he did just now, we've heard them before. We know what the playbook is. It'll be interesting to see if any of the jurors want to talk, particularly with the anonymity that they've been given. If we want to talk about big book deals and big paydays for interviews, these people are going to command top dollar, but they're going to put a lot on the line, starting with their personal safety.
What it was like in the room
Yeah.
when that decision was made.
As we continue monitoring live pictures from New York City, a couple cameras set up. This is outside the courthouse in Manhattan as the former president's motorcade kind of sits there waiting for him to emerge to take him I don't know where, and I believe this is probably, is this outside Trump Tower? I know there's a camera. This is also at the courthouse. All right, yeah, pretty heavy security there, but no crowds at the moment, but we are getting a couple more reports from people who were inside that courtroom when the verdict was read. This is Trump Tower, I guess, after the bus moves. This is the scene outside of Trump Tower where, frankly, there's a crowd outside there any day of the week of just tourists kind of gawking and taking photos. But back to some of the new accounts we're getting from people who were inside the courtroom when that guilty verdict was read. More of them saying Trump sat stone-faced as the verdict was read. Cheering from the street below could be heard. There were cheers from supporters and detractors of the former president, and that noise from the crowd outside at the time could be heard up in the hallway on the 15th floor of the courthouse. So it was loud outside there earlier when the verdict was read, but no reports of any safety issues or any problems out there right now. And at least from the cameras we've been watching, I mean, of course, this street's cordoned off, but from the rest of the courthouse, it doesn't appear like a huge crowd's gathered whatsoever.
Yeah, we're standing by, and of course, we have several cameras in different angles, so we'll bounce around and keep you posted on things as they unfold live. But let's go ahead and listen in to what he had to say when he walked out of court after being found guilty on all 34 felony counts, what he said to the crowd. Take a listen.
This was a disgrace. This was a rigged trial by a conflicted judge who was corrupt. It's a rigged trial, a disgrace. They wouldn't give us a venue change. We were at 5% or 6% in this district, in this area. This was a rigged, disgraceful trial. The real verdict is going to be November 5th by the people. And they know what happened here, and everybody knows what happened here. You have a Soros-backed DA, and the whole thing, we didn't do a thing wrong. I'm a very innocent man, and it's okay. I'm fighting for our country. I'm fighting for our Constitution. Our whole country is being rigged right now. This was done by the Biden administration in order to wound or hurt an opponent, a political opponent. And I think it's just a disgrace. And we'll keep fighting. We'll fight till the end and we'll win. Because our country's gone to hell. We don't have the same country anymore. We have a divided mess. We're a nation in decline, serious decline. Millions and millions of people pouring into our country right now. From prisons and from mental institutions, terrorists. And they're taking over our country. We have a country that's in big trouble. But this was a rigged decision right from day one with a conflicted judge who should have never been allowed to try this case, never. And we will fight for our Constitution. This is long from over. Thank you very much.
So you heard his words, what he chose to focus on there, repeating the same speech that he said
That's his
day
campaign
after,
stunt speech. That's
day
what he
after,
tells all
again
of his
and again.
crowds. It was the same speech.
So he says the country's gone to hell and we're a divided mess. What's interesting is his campaign team has said they don't believe a guilty verdict will hurt his run for the White House. So it's really interesting to see. This is a very contentious presidential run once again as we face up into November. What's going to happen here? You know, you have people who are on the fence, who are eager for change, but is this the change they want to see? And you know, how will today's verdict impact what happens? As he said, the real verdict will come in November at the ballot box with voters like you.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the political fallout or ramifications are still to be determined over the next few months. I mean, I think there were a number of polls which showed that a criminal conviction would sway some voters who are on the fence. But it, of course, depends on where they are. Are they in a swing state? And I mean, a poll is a poll, a snapshot in a moment of time. So we'll have to see what the political ramifications of this are. Jason Lamb, a former prosecutor and defense attorney here in the studio with us. You know, I feel like we have to fact check him when he says things like this is the work of the Biden White House. This has nothing to do with the Department of Justice. This was brought in New York City by the local district attorney there. So this has nothing to do with the Biden White House. But Jason, there are 3 other criminal cases that are still looming, but they are not likely. Is that Trump walking out now? Yeah.
Okay, it was hard
to
to tell.
So. Right, potentially.
Definitely Secret Service. Yeah, it doesn't
More
look like that
people are
was
filtering
him.
out.
But yeah, his entourage is starting to emerge from the courthouse. You see all the
There he is.
caravan of SUVs.
That's him in the middle, I believe. Yeah, leaving. So Jason, 3 other criminal cases in the works, correct? And this, though, is likely to be the only one we see play out before the election.
Likely correct. We can start with a classified document case in Florida. Judge Aileen Cannon, through her rulings, has seemed to indicate that the case will not get a trial date before the election. There are obviously a lot of criticisms of Judge Cannon's rulings. Will the special counsel try and have her removed? That remains to play out. We won't see that before November 5th. Then moving north to Atlanta, we have the election fraud case similar to what was recently filed by the Arizona Attorney General here with fake electors and the call to the Secretary of State about finding votes. That has gone on to a little bit of a tangent. The judge there just recently allowed a co-defendant to get a hold of ballots to determine whether it's fraud or not. And then, of course, Fani Willis, unforced error, own goal, if you would, for being involved in a romantic relationship with Nathan Wade, who she brought into the office to handle this case. That ate up a lot of time, a lot of bandwidth. That issue of disqualification is on appeal. And for folks at home, Nathan Wade resigned from the case and from the office as a special prosecutor, and of course the judge allowed the Fulton County District Attorney's Office to stay on. The various defendants in that case want that office off altogether. Her unforced error, I'm beside myself why any lawyer would do that. Then we get to the DC case, certainly that's Judge Tanya Chutkin, and we have the presidential immunity issue, and that has been argued in front of the Supreme Court. We will have a ruling probably in 30 days or less.
As to whether a president can face this kind of charge?
Correct, and there are official acts and personal acts. What I suspect, and we talked a couple minutes ago about reading tea leaves, here we go anyway, that the Supreme Court is going to say that a trial court, in this case Judge Chutkin, will have to make factual determinations as to individual and specific acts, whether they're personal or official. That could happen this summer, and then there's a question of how fast Judge Chutkin will set a trial date in that case. So they're all hanging in the balance right now. Of the remaining cases, I think that the DC case is most likely to go forward next, in the Atlanta case, and Florida's pretty much off our radar. But we'll see, and we'll see what sort of rhetoric comes, in the coming hours and days, as Donald Trump is now on his way, presumably back to Trump Tower. I'm sure his surrogates will be speaking. Alina Habba, who was one of his lawyers previously in the civil defamation, if you would, sexual assault case. His sons will be speaking, and of course the various members of Congress who have been accompanying the former president to court and effectively circumventing the gag order by saying the things that Donald Trump was not allowed to say. So I think we'll hear a lot more. Right now there are some shockwaves in the Trump camp, and they're going to have to recalibrate. And as Jared, you pointed out a minute ago, it's the same old rhetoric. This is Biden's DOJ. No, it's not. It's Alvin Bragg in the New York District Attorney's Office. This is about open borders and immigration. No, this is about falsification of records. And, it's not about whether you agree with a verdict in this case or any other case. I know that I have won cases I should have lost. I have lost cases I should have won. Mm-hmm. The process was followed. Due process was given, and to the extent that the former president's attorneys feel that it was not, they can appeal that. Yeah. But at this point, Donald Trump has been convicted on 34 counts.
And it would have only taken one of those jurors to say, no, I don't want to go along with this.
And you asked me a few minutes ago, how is this different than the civil findings that were made? And we talked about the burden of proof, but I think you raise a great point now to say that this is a unanimous jury of 12 people. In civil, it doesn't have to be unanimous. All 12 jurors had to agree. So that does add to the gravity and significance of the conviction in this case.
You're watching a live look from aerial helicopters following the former president's motorcade leaving the courthouse in Manhattan. And it was interesting because the streets were lined by hundreds of people, and some of them were waving American flags. It's very difficult from that vantage point to see
tell
which side they're on. I know. And I know you were reading something from the AP earlier about chants that were downstairs on the ground level outside the courthouse that could be heard upstairs on the 15th floor. Were those cheers in favor of the verdict?
It was a mixed crowd downstairs. It was a mixed crowd.
Okay.
Yeah. And I think that's I was trying to figure out where this is, so I think that was the Manhattan Bridge that they just drove by there. So, Kylie, do we know, is he going to Trump Tower or maybe one of the airports? All right, reports are that he's expected to go to Trump Tower from here, because sometimes after these things, he'll head to the airport and head back to Mar-a-Lago. Jason, there are no restrictions on where he can go, right? I mean, before sentencing, for a case like this.
Release conditions can change. And what we didn't get out of the courtroom is whether or not the district attorney sought a modification in release conditions. Because when someone's release conditions are set, we are operating under the presumption of innocence. Donald Trump no longer has that presumption because he's been found guilty. Could the prosecution seek to restrict his release conditions? They could.
Like house arrest, or?
It's conceivable. Do I think it will happen? No. In this case, Jared, I would say house arrest is punitive. Normally it is to prevent the flight or escape of the defendant, but he does have a Secret Service detail. There's not a whole lot of places. They will. There's not a whole lot of places on this earth he can hang out in secrecy. But the gag order, in theory, the trial is over, and if Donald Trump continues to vent about the judge and witnesses, that's something that could impact sentencing.
One of the attorneys who's quite known nationally and is somewhat a supporter of Donald Trump, he just said that in addition to the July 11th sentencing date, there's a probation interview that will be set for Trump. All motions have to be filed by June 13th. What's a probation interview?
Okay, and you may be referring to Norm Eisen.
I'm referring to Jonathan Turley.
Okay, constitutional scholar at George Washington University, but great minds think alike. So when an individual is convicted, again, this is a pretty standard national practice, and a conviction can come by a jury or it can come by a plea agreement too. The probation department will write a recommendation to the judge, and that recommendation includes biographical data, social data. Does this individual have any needs that probation can address? For example, substance abuse, domestic violence. Now, 95% of all cases resolve via plea agreements, if not more. And judges don't know a whole lot about the cases until sentencing. And I sat for a few years as a part-time fill-in judge in Maricopa County, and I would read through the probation reports either the night before or the morning. So, okay, now I know what this case is about a little bit. Wow. It's very different in a trial when a judge presides over the case, particularly when there's extensive motion practice, so they know what's going on. And, you know, Donald Trump is not just a random citizen, you know, from Brooklyn who comes through the court.
He's like the most famous person in the world, one of them.
One of them.
You know, we know quite a bit about him.
But because these falsified record hearings are very common, this probation recommendation could mean a lot to the defense. If the judge goes above and beyond that and seems punitive, that could be more of a grounds for an appeal.
Well, probation historically will try and apply uniform recommendations. Whether it's Donald Trump or someone else in New York who is cooking the books or what have you. But they're not binding on the court, Nicole. And the judge can impose any sentence below or above the probation recommendation because it's just that. It is a recommendation, and sentencing is left up to the court. One of the interesting things during a closing argument where I think we really saw Judge Merchan come unglued when Todd Blanche talked about sending Donald Trump to prison. Lawyers are not allowed to argue penalty, period. And in fact, in this case, there was actually a pretrial motion known as a motion in limine by the prosecution to prevent the defense from making such an argument. Now, normally, those of us who have been trial attorneys for more than 5 minutes know that you don't need a specific court order. You just don't do that. I don't need a court order to tell me that the sky is blue. But there was such an order. And when Todd Blanche did that, Judge Juan Merchan pretty much came unglued. He said it was outrageous.
Yeah. So we see sentencing set for July 11th. That is a Thursday. The following Monday, July 15th, is the Republican National Convention. So, Jason, you think that July 11th date probably won't stand anyway?
Well, the first thing that's going to happen is we get these pretrial motions dealt with. And I believe you said June 13th was the deadline.
Yeah.
So the defense will file a motion for a new trial, a motion to set aside the verdict, et cetera, et cetera. The prosecution will then have an opportunity to respond, and the defense will get a reply, which is the last word because they are filing the motion. That will take the better part of the month of June, and at that point the judge will prepare for litigation of those motions. He may or may not have a hearing on them. He may give a written decision, but if he does have a hearing, that will take some time and likely push back the sentencing. Nothing is moving fast on this case. Everyone is long-winded because of the stakes and the players involved. So I'm not betting on July 11th, but it will certainly be before November 5th.
Yeah.
Okay, we're getting some reaction on social media from our Arizona congressional delegation, so we'll go ahead and put those up on the screen for you here. This is Congresswoman Debbie Lesko, who is not running for re-election. She says very few people thought Trump would receive any fair treatment in New York, and the judge and prosecutor proved us right with their historic and unprecedented efforts to interfere in the 2024 election. Americans see through this distortion of justice and will render their own verdict in November, end quote.
I mean, members of Arizona's Republican delegation in Congress are just staunch supporters of former President Trump. Here's Representative Andy Biggs, who represents a big part of the East Valley, calling today's verdict a travesty of justice. Again, these were 12 jurors, citizens from New York. Goes on to say Joe Biden's regime has made a mockery. Okay, well, that's not true. Again, this has nothing to do with the Biden administration. But Congressman Biggs was one of the many members of Congress who did show up, went to New York City, stood outside the courthouse and spoke on behalf of former President Trump as the trial was going on.
And Representative Paul Gosar also posting on social media, justice is lost, just 9 minutes ago. So those are anticipated reaction that you're seeing from that Arizona Republican congressional delegation. Now, it was interesting, Jason, because you mentioned the appeal can't happen until after sentencing, just underscoring that. So you mentioned that it's likely the defense will file motion after motion trying to do anything and everything that they can on the grounds of potential abuse of discretion. Are there any other motions you anticipate before this sentencing?
Motion for new
timeline?
trial, motion to vacate the jury's verdict as it's contrary to the weight of the evidence, and no reasonable juror could come to that conclusion. I just don't think that's going to happen here. Judges are very, very reluctant to set aside the deliberations and hard work of jurors. That's not going to happen. And on the motion for new trial, what else could we expect? Stormy Daniels giving testimony about whether or not Donald Trump was wearing a condom. It's probably a little too early to talk about that at 3 o'clock, but the reality is, the defense took great umbrage with that because there were guardrails about what Stormy Daniels could and could not talk about, and the judge gave what's called a curative instruction, and judges can do that.
Yeah, I mean, there were a number of salacious details, but at the end of the day, the jury found Donald Trump guilty on 34 counts of falsifying business documents, business records, stemming from that hush money payment.
And that sentencing is slated for July 11th, a potential 4 years in prison for each of those counts. And again, we'll be waiting to see what happens with that. But you're looking at live aerials of helicopters following the former president's motorcade, leaving Manhattan. We're going to continue with a special report on CBS 5 and head to our local news at 3 on 3 TV with more continued coverage.
And I think it's just a